Be inspired, supported, and empowered. This is the Global Healthy Living Foundation Podcast Network.
You're listening to Healthcare Matters, the podcast that pulls back the curtain to help you make sense of complex healthcare economics and policy issues. With us is Dr. Robert Popovian in Washington, D.C. He's a pharmacist, an economist, and the Chief Science Policy Officer at the Global Healthy Living Foundation.
And as always, joining me is my good friend Ben Blanc, dialing in from heartland of the United States, Indianapolis, Indiana, and our Associate Director of Digital Production and Engagement. So Ben, how was the Indy 500 this last weekend?
Well, this year the race got a little delayed for a few hours because of the rain, but you know what? It was well worth it. More time to do what French people do best, that is eat and drink, and just a great day overall. And 33 drivers zoomed by the green flag at the tracks, and we had a repeat winner this year, Joseph Newgarden. He won 2 years in a row.
Yeah, I saw that. In fact, something that hasn't happened in over 20 years. That's unbelievable. So moving forward, the high speeds of Indianapolis, Indiana, and the Indy 500, let's switch gears and race to the worlds of gene therapy, where precision and advanced technology are also driving major breakthroughs in medicines every day.
Wow, smooth transition there, Robert. And today with us to talk about gene therapy, we have a special guest, Dr. Anne Sydor, who's one of our colleagues. Anne is the Director of Research Development and Communications at GHLF. So let's dive in. Thanks for joining us, Anne.
It's my pleasure to be here.
So Anne, you're no stranger to our listeners. You've been on the show before. Could you introduce yourself briefly to those joining us for the first time?
My name is Anne Sydor, and I am the Director of Research Development at the Global Healthy Living Foundation, which means I help design and find funding for all of our research work. I am also the founder and principal of VT4, which is a consulting agency that helps people with research design and development, and also with writing papers on all kinds of scientific topics.
So we always start our episode with a key number that relates to the episode's topic. And today, Robert, that number is 5,000. Can you tell us what this number means?
So 5,000 is the number of gene therapy trials that are listed in the National Institutes of Health's database, including an increase of as many new trials incorporating chimeric antigen receptor, CAR-T, otherwise known as CAR-T cell therapies, and human genomic editing studies that are ongoing. And later on in the episode, Anne will talk about where are we with regards to specifically gene therapies and how many and what type of therapies are in the marketplace right now for helping patients get better.
Very clear. Well, actually, let's start with you, Robert. Could you share what the reasoning was behind your collaborative paper that you wrote with Anne, titled Value and Pricing Models for Gene Therapy Replacements, the Current State of Affairs?
That's a great question. So first of all, the report was published through the Pioneer Institute, where Anne and I collaborated with each other in that level as well, in that institute as well. I'm a visiting health policy fellow there, and Anne is a guest expert that we brought on to help us draft the paper and also write and provide her opinion on the topic. So what was the impetus? Frankly, the impetus started for me about a decade ago when I first got involved in the policy space regarding gene therapies, and a lot of the hyperbole at that time was the price tags of these products that were coming into the market. There was a lot of discussion, concerns about the dollar amounts that these products were being introduced at. And frankly, what we decided to do, myself and as well as Dr. Bill Smith, who is our other co-author, is to write a paper to sort of level set of how pricing is done, why it's done this way, the hurdles that gene therapies go through, and specifically also for the audience that is mostly policy folks and also individuals who are interested in politics. What is gene therapy and how does that help patients? And that's why Anne was so invaluable to the work, because she brought on the scientific background of helping us understand better what is gene therapy and how patients are going to benefit from it, and some of the hurdles with regards to the research and development.
So many questions. Well, thanks for the insightful background, Robert. Now, Anne, for our listeners who might be new to this field, and also because this topic is a lot to digest, at least for me, Could you give us a brief overview of what gene therapy entails and how it works? So, what is it exactly?
Happy to share this a little bit. And this is really where I specialize is in taking very complex scientific topics and communicating them in simple ways. So to be as simple as possible, gene therapy is broadly defined as the use or modification of any genetic material to treat disease. Genetic material might be DNA, which is what codes our genes, or RNA, which is produced by our genes and translated into proteins. Now, within that broad definition of gene therapy, there are three key types. One introduces or increases the production of a protein with a therapeutic function, and that might be a cancer-killing gene or something that activates the immune system. Second is by replacing a dysfunctional gene with a functional copy. And third is by silencing a dysfunctional gene or a gene mutation. So those are the three ways that genetic material can treat disease. The effects can be achieved in multiple ways. We can take cells from a patient, change the DNA within those cells, and then retransplant them back into the patient. That's the CAR T therapy that Robert just spoke about. We can also introduce gene therapies with a viral vector, which is given as an infusion into the blood or spinal fluid or as an intramuscular injection. And then with RNA therapies, those can be delivered in multiple ways as well, usually through infusion or injection. Our paper focused on gene therapies that replaced dysfunctional genes with viral vectors that are injected, infused, or put into a muscle. We can talk about more than that during this conversation, of course.
Well, that's a great introduction to gene therapy and Gene Therapy 101. So can you expand on that a little bit? And actually, you've just mentioned it briefly. You've touched on treatments. So what are some of the gene therapy treatments that are available today, and how are they transforming patient care?
So there are about 25 gene therapies that have been approved by the Food and Drug Administration. Most of those are cell replacement therapies where a person's own cells are modified and then reintroduced to that person. About a half dozen are gene replacement therapies, where new DNA is being introduced into a person's cells. And another half dozen are RNA therapies, where RNA that changes the way DNA is expressed is introduced into a person's cells.
Yeah, thank you. However, these innovations come at a cost, right? So, Robert, could you explain why gene therapies tend to be so expensive? What are the main factors that contribute to high costs associated with gene therapies?
Well, that's a great question. And that's why we started with the discussion about why we wrote the paper, right? It was the hand-wringing about the price of these medicines when they're introduced in the market. So when you start peeling the onion, you realize that most of these gene therapies are a great value, because a lot of these patients are going to require treatments for life. And a lot of these gene therapies are a cure, not all of them. Most of them are cures, and that type of treatment for life costs a lot of money. So when you look at a price of a gene therapy, you have to compare it to what it would cost a patient to be managed throughout their lifetime. But there's other issues with regards to how the price is set. Number one, most of these gene therapies, if not all of them, are for rare or ultra rare diseases. Very few patients are going to benefit from it. But the cost of research and development is significant, and it's not coming down, and in fact it's increasing. And therefore, for a company to be able to recoup some of the costs, they have to be able to price it at a certain level. And remember, when you don't have enough patients to pass that cost on to, the price per person will be significantly higher, although the overall cost to the system or health system or the government is not significant because there aren't that many patients. So that's the second reason why the prices are set. But the third reason, and something that Anne always reminds me, is the value that these drugs bring to society. First of all, a lot of them are cures, like we talked about. So there's the value of a cure versus management of a disease long term. Number two, some of these gene therapies are life-extending therapies. That means they extend life expectancy for a lot of these patients. So when you look at a patient who without gene therapy may live, for example, 2 years versus now with a gene therapy may live 25, 30 years. There's a value that life brings to society that is almost incalculable at times. But we have tried to do that in our paper and talk about that to a certain extent. And also the productivity that individual brings. It's not just the value of having that individual live longer, but also there's some productivity involved. So because of those reasons, you can't just look at the price tag of a medicine. What you have to look at is the price of the medicine comparatively to what it would cost to keep the patient alive or even live long enough with other type of treatments. You have to compare it to the cost, the recouping of investment that needs to be done by a pharmaceutical company. But most importantly, the value that these individuals now bring if they're healthy and productive. And as I said, that's a really big number that is sometimes incalculable, but it's something that we need to keep an eye on, because if a patient lives longer and they're more productive to society, that means that the return on investment is much better. So in other words, policymakers, decision makers, when they just look at the price, they can't just look at the price. They have to look at what the alternative would be without this type of treatment.
Yeah, very interesting. And you also mentioned briefly accessibility, and I feel like that's also another very interesting point. So understanding the cost structures definitely gives us a clearer picture on this. But there is something else, and maybe we should talk about the regulatory hurdles and challenges. And could you tell us what challenges are currently impacting the accessibility of gene therapies and how might these be addressed?
Absolutely. And, Robert spoke very coherently about the fact that, when we talk about a human life and the value of a human life, that's really priceless. None of us can put a price tag on that. Some agencies try to put value on human life with value adjusted years lived or disability adjusted life years, things like that. But that really starts comparing the value of one life to another. And we think that's really not something that any of us are able to do. We do see that these are life extending therapies that are revolutionary, and it's still new science. And the fact that it's new science is really what also adds to the cost. So these are diseases that treat very small numbers of people. Because gene therapy is directed at a mutation in a known gene that causes a disease, it's only the people with a problem in that specific gene who will benefit from a treatment. So the number of people who would receive a treatment is small. However, the cost of development not only remains high as it does for any drug, the cost of developing gene therapy is much, much higher than the cost of developing or producing a small molecule, for example. So you have to go through clinical trials. And with a rare disease, clinical trials are more expensive because it's more difficult to find the people with the disease to enroll in the trial. Then you also have to do genetic testing to make sure that they really do have the gene difference that is being targeted. Next, you not only have to develop the gene therapy, you have to develop the delivery mechanism, the viral vector that it's going to be delivered to the patient on. Both the gene therapy, the viral vector, and the two in combination have to be tested for safety and efficacy in current FDA regulations. So that basically triples the complexity of these clinical trials. On top of that, we're producing biological molecules. It's not like a chemical reaction where we put a lot of chemicals into a vat, stir them together, dehydrate them, and compress that into pills. This gene therapy requires having biological cells, bacteria or other cells, produce genetic material. Those cells have to be grown in dishes, and those dishes then have to be harvested. It's a much more complex manufacturing process that takes a much more highly trained workforce. And on top of that, the FDA requires that all of those processes be finalized before clinical trials even begin. That takes an enormous investment of upfront capital that is impossible to recoup if a particular experimental therapy turns out not to be beneficial. So we have all of these elements that make the research and development of gene therapy significantly more expensive than other treatments. Yet the regulations for those clinical trials are the same as if we were testing any other biologic or small molecule therapy. So we think that there are ways that the FDA could ease the burden on gene therapy development, for example, by using manufacturing standards rather than having to approve each and every manufacturing process prior to beginning clinical trials. There are several bodies that do best practice manufacturing processes to maintain quality. Those could be adapted. The FDA could also and has started to consider platform trials where multiple drugs are being tested or multiple medications are being tested against one placebo group. Additionally, looking at natural history studies as a control versus a placebo controlled group. So, there are a few things with regulations that could really ease the burden of clinical trials for developing these medications. And finally, again, changing the regulatory model for manufacturing processes would also bring down the price because that upfront capital investment would become a much lower burden.
Thank you, Anne, for also placing the spotlight back on the patient here. I think it's very important. So, with these regulatory insights, it seems like there is a need for broader systemic changes. Robert, do you think a new payment model is required in the United States to manage the costs of gene therapies?
So that's a great question. So initially, I would say my thinking was always the same as others that, yeah, we do need a new payment model in the United States. But the more I've thought about it, and look, there's been a lot of academic work done on this topic. To MIT specifically, Mark Trusheim has done a ton of work, great work. It's been published, but it's all theoretical. There's no model that has been developed in the US to pay for these therapies differently than what we have currently going on. So my initial thinking was that, yes, we do need a new payment model in the United States, perhaps with some of these drugs, for two reasons. Number one, the cost involved, the person who pays for it, the insurer or the government agency, is not necessarily the one that's going to benefit long-term from it, because as we know, we have a bifurcated insurance model in the United States where everybody under 65 is on some type of a commercial insurance versus 65 and older is on Medicare. And plus on the commercial side, we don't have consistency that the patient stays with the same insurer throughout their life. They may change around. So the whole thinking was, well, is it fair, for example, for United Health to pay for a gene therapy of a 20-year-old, let's say, and that will extend the life of that 20-year-old well above 65. And then let's assume that 20-year-old leaves after a year and goes and enrolls with Cigna, for example. And Cigna is now benefiting from this healthy individual coming to them while United had incurred all the costs. Is it fair? So that's the number one reason why people are thinking we need a new payment model, is that how do we have that individual that invests in that gene therapy also benefits from it long term as the one that is paying for this care. So that's number one reason. Number two reason is that there's some risk involved, right, with these therapies. As I said, yes, some of them are cures, but some are not necessarily cures. They reduce the burden of the disease. And remember, a lot of these therapies are also relatively new. We don't know what happens years and years down the line. So should there be some risk associated with these therapies for the biopharmaceutical industry who's developing these things? Should they take on some of the risk? Because at the end of the day, it is an unknown that we're getting into. My thinking was always that, yes, because of those two reasons, we need a new payment model and we need to develop one as soon as possible for them to flourish, gene therapies to flourish. Over the years, though, I've done a lot of research and thinking about this. And frankly, we already do similar interventions and we pay for similar interventions through the current model that we have that are high cost with long-term effect, with limited knowledge of what the long-term impact is, and they're high risk. And it's for small patient populations. I brought this up in the past, and I compared gene therapy to something like transplants in the United States. And we had 46,000 transplants done in 2023 in the United States. It was about a 9% increase compared to the previous year. And argument against that always has been from individuals, well, the transplant market is limited, right? It's limited by the number of organ donations and everything else. Well, yes and no. It is limited to that effect, but we see that there's a year-over-year increase of transplants done in the US, and now we're getting into more non-human organ donation transplants that can expand that market significantly. And if you think about it, it's a high-cost intervention that is borne by the individual, that the initial payer, that may not get the benefit long-term. It is an unknown outcome long-term about this, and it's a risky intervention. A lot of transplants fail. In fact, I just had a family member who passed away who had a bone marrow transplant, and he passed away within like 3 months of that happening. So do we really need a new payment model, or can we manage this through the current payment model that we have in the US? And my answer is, I don't know. I was much more confident before looking at the transplant numbers and the way that the transplant market is moving to say, yes, we do need one. But now that I'm looking at that market, maybe other things that we do, for example, a hip replacement, replacement, that again, somebody bears the cost initially and then somebody else benefits from it long-term as an insurer, has convinced me that perhaps we need to do more thinking about this, that maybe the current payment model is good enough. As Anne said, we modify the R&D development process. We have competition in the market where it drives down these prices, and then we'll see if we really do need to change the payment model. But at this point, in my thinking, is that it's an unknown because of other interventions that I've mentioned.
Robert, I think that's a really great point, and it's an important and somewhat different way of looking at gene therapy than what I commonly see or hear from people. So when we think about medications and when we think about gene therapy as medications, we run into problems comparing the pricing models and the payment models because we're looking at a one-time treatment for a small group of people versus medications for chronic diseases which get taken day after day, week after week, month after month, and paid for on that basis as well. So the lifetime cost of a treatment taken for years and years and years is not that different from the lifetime cost of a gene therapy. What is different is that the treatment happens once. So when you just compared those one-time treatments not to other medications, but to procedures that are also one-time treatments, thinking about gene therapy as akin to a knee replacement or an organ transplant, and comparing how we pay for gene therapy in the same way that we pay for those kinds of one-time procedural treatments may really be a way to revolutionize thinking around gene therapy payment. And I'd love to hear what other people have to say about that in the future.
I love how you just opened the floor to finish this episode, and I think it's actually a really great way to conclude. So thank you, Anne. Thank you, Robert. And it sounds like the future of gene therapy is shaped by the pivotal role of innovation and regulation, and addressing high costs and regulatory challenges will be crucial. But I'm not the expert, so Robert, you have the last word.
I want to thank Anne, first of all, for joining us. And the last word is that Anne and I would like to bring on somebody in a future podcast to debate us about this new payment model, because I thought her point was brilliant. I think we need to look at this gene therapy as more of a procedure rather than a therapy or a treatment that it's been coined. And I think this groupthink about that we need a completely new payment model to be able to get these type of treatments or procedures to patients is a fallacy. And there's enough evidence that we do other type of interventions which are far more risky and unknown outcomes, and we are able to pay for them appropriately and have patients have access to them. So my thinking is we want to have a debate. Let's bring those people on a future podcast and let's have a discussion about this. But overall, I have to say, Ben, again, going back to my original comment about why this paper was so important for us to write and why Pioneer Institute was interested in it and why Bill, Ann, and I co-authored the paper, is this whole notion that policymakers just get spooked by the dollar amount that they see. And they need to just step back and compare that dollar amount to the value that these products bring in, the cost savings that they will incur over a lifetime time of treatment. And also that, look, at the end of the day, we're talking about very few people, so the overall cost into the system is minuscule. Yes, the individual incremental cost may be high, but overall cost is going to be significantly lower than a traditional biopharmaceutical.
Well, thanks for breaking that down for us, Robert, and we'll absolutely keep our listeners updated when we know when part 2 of this episode will happen. I think that was some very valuable information for our listeners. Anne, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insight.
My pleasure.
To our listeners, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you might be listening so you never miss an episode. And if you have a second, help spread the word by rating our podcast, writing a positive review, and sharing with your family and friends. It will help more people like you find us.
And I want to also mention to our listeners, as always, that if you have any questions, thoughts, suggestions, comments, future topics that you want us to discuss, please send us an email on podcasts@ghlf.org. And, as always, we will do our best to address those. And if we see something that is compelling enough, we may even ask you to come and join us on one of our podcasts.
We certainly will. And before you go, make sure you take a listen to some of our other great podcasts on the GHLF Podcast Network. You can find all of GHLF's podcasts at ghlf.org/listen. He's Dr. Robert Popovian.
And he's Ben Blanc. And we'll see you all next time.
Be inspired, supported, and empowered. This is the Global Healthy Living Foundation Podcast Network.